Happy Friday, ambitious readers. Welcome back to another edition of Reading Ambitiously, where every single week we bring you the most powerful ideas that are shaping our world. We've got a huge, big idea in store for you this week. We've got our new Mac Mini. It finally arrived. It took 3 months to get here because we needed the certain amount of unified memory. We've got versions of the AmbitiousOS now running on small local language models. So really excited to write about that in future editions, but today's edition is about the AmbitiousOS. It's a very big idea. So let's go ahead and jump right into the 7 primitives of building a personal AI operating system. And I've got the AmbitiousOS because we're going to do a lot of demonstrations today. And I think after today's edition of Reading Ambitiously, you are going to leave with my best version of the common understanding of how these things come together to create the ultimate AI operating system. So let's go ahead and jump right in. If I ask the AmbitiousOS, when was the first time that I ever wrote about this idea? I get the answer really fast. In fact, incredibly fast. It was January 30th, 2026. That's much faster than I would have been able to get it from Google or by going to readingambitiously.com. And that's how I would have done it in the old world. But in the new world, AI can answer questions really fast for us. And this is a great way to use AI. In fact, I think the majority of the world is using it in this function, which is something like a better version of Google. But the more I use this technology, the more I'm at least personally convinced this is the least interesting way to use AI. Because let's ask it another question. Hey, AmbitiousOS, how has my thinking on AI changed since we initially launched? Now we're cooking, because this is a totally different kind of question. The AmbitiousOS is not just retrieving the January 30th edition. It is giving me a perspective across something like 30 different data points and more than 5 editions that remind me that we've been writing about this all year, starting back in January when we talked about the initial build, and in February when we introduced concepts like memory and how important the data set is, which is curated mostly today by people, the nature of it becoming always on versus us having to prompt it. And of course, last month I started to talk about how I think this is a new form of knowledge work. And this is, I think, where things get really interesting when you see how all of these pieces start to fit together. And I think this is the power, the real power of this technology. And there's a great line from John Culkin, the Jesuit priest. He says, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." And Silicon Valley absolutely loves this line, but let me be the evidence of what I've been writing about all year and how that is taking shape in the tools that I'm building and how those tools are helping me do this job. And the path that I've been on is only 4 months old. We wrote our first line of code for the AmbitiousOS just 4 months ago. And it has unfolded something like this. First, we ingested well over 100 editions and all the primary research that go into becoming an issue of Reading Ambitiously, and that became searchable. But very quickly, we realized that retrieval and search were interesting, but what was a lot more interesting was when we started to help the AI understand how all of this context actually relates to itself. And we built out a knowledge graph and started to categorize concepts, companies, people, products. We have over 1,071 entities in the Reading Ambitiously OS today, over 9,000 connections amongst them. And that graph ultimately evolved into our first version of memory. And that has since expanded to include what are now assertions and predictions and trajectories and claims that actually get resolved. We developed a series of tools that AmbitiousOS has available to it to help it operationalize the workflows that are ongoing in it. And those workflows became skills. Skills are the onboarding instructions for the agent that allow you to do repeated procedures over and over again and define your definition of done. And then we introduced routines so that these things happen automatically. They happen overnight. And ultimately, we have now made it portable so that you can bring it with you into other places where you are doing work. And I know that sounds technical because great products ultimately become magical and frictionless, but in a hobbyist way. Let my experience be evidence for what I think is the emerging system architecture for AI native. Because AI shines when it has the right context in the right place at the right time and with the right tools to act on it. And what's becoming clearer and clearer to me every day as I continue to enhance the AmbitiousOS is that I think every knowledge worker, every company, every team is going to want some version of this. So let's unpack the 7 primitives that this is architected around. They are context, memory, skills, tools, routines, portability, and the newest, the build loop. So let's talk about each of them. The first is context. What are the inputs and how do they relate? Like I said, the first initial ingestion of data into the AmbitiousOS was 100 editions of our newsletter. But very quickly, we realized that after we had the help of Claude Code setting that up and labeling that data, that we needed a knowledge graph to help understand how that data relates to each other. A knowledge graph is a map of things and how they relate, whether they're people or companies or ideas or themes. These things all live near each other because useful knowledge is rarely an isolated fact, right? It is very valuable when you realize how it can relate to other things. And in the reading ambitiously context, we're able to do that now. If I pick on OpenAI, let's see if I can grab the OpenAI node here. We know that OpenAI has been mentioned over 54 times in the editions of Reading Ambitiously, and it relates to ChatGPT and Anthropic and Sam Altman and DeepSeek and Microsoft and NVIDIA and tokens and a broader set of ideas that are essentially in the same neighborhood of thought. And the power comes when you and your AI stop thinking about these things as disconnected notes, but rather as having relationships with each other, because this can really refine how all of the inputs start to formulate the way that you and the model will think together. The second primitive that we're going to talk about today is memory. Now, I'm not talking about storing files and retrieving those files. I'm talking about preserving meaning. A good memory system allows you to rewind the tape and understand what you and the system thought at a certain point in time, whether it's something you believed, when you believed it, if your beliefs changed, whether those claims still hold. And with the help of AI, actually predictions and the ultimate resolution of those predictions. And the latest version of AmbitiousOS does this. It tags claims, predictions, recommendations, opinions, confidence levels on those things. I think right now we're at about a 69% track record on 35 of 100 resolved predictions. And this is meaningful shift from just asking AI, like, what have I written about OpenAI? I get a retrieval. But if I ask AI, how has my thinking on OpenAI changed? Now the memory comes into play. The first question finds artifacts, but the second question helps me reason through how my thoughts have changed. And that's what memory essentially helps the AI do. And right now, this is a very nascent space. It's an emerging space. There aren't any definitive solutions for this. So I've had to build a lot of this myself, but I sure think they're coming. And if you're a user of ChatGPT or Claude today, the next time you're using it and you want it to remember something, just tell it to commit that something to memory. Now, the third primitive are skills. How should this work be done? Skills are repeatable procedures, and you could think of a skill as onboarding documents for your agents. You spell out the task, you explain the process, you define what good looks like and what done means in your words. This is important because a lot of what we're using AI to help us with in knowledge work is mundane. It's repetitive. Every week, I have to gather inputs for reading ambitiously and evaluate links and make sure they're formatted correctly and ultimately manufacture the HTML that goes into this newsletter and do the copy editing before I hit send to you. For years, that process lived in my head and it was entirely manual. The AmbitiousOS using skills helps me actually drive that process. And what you have to do is you got to write them down. They can be improved. They're ultimately version controlled, and then they can be reused. And so that when you give your agents similar bodies of work, they can repeatedly continue to do that work and do it well. A skill turns one piece of a messy process into something the AI can run reliably. And it becomes a component of how you're manufacturing the ultimate work and outcome. And the practical lesson is to look for work that you repeat, what you do every week, and what process you would like to teach a new hire if they were being brought on the team to support you. The skills ultimately tell the AI how work should be done. And then the third primitive. The fourth primitive is tools. What can the system actually do? And we can actually just ask the AmbitiousOS to help us do that. What tools do you have available? If skills are onboarding instructions for your agents, then tools are actually how those agents do something operationally. The model's good at reasoning, but the tools let it do something, whether it's search the archive or query the knowledge base. When I start a new edition of Reading Ambitiously, these tools help the model move through the archive and actually retrieve grounded context from previous editions. Instead of just guessing and predicting what I wrote, they're able to actually access the ground truth. If I wrote about something like the transition tax, they can go directly to that issue, fetch it, and add it to the context window. Tools are where the action happens. And the question to ask in your own work is what did the AI need besides the answer that I'm asking for, right? Should it pull files? Should it take a look at your note-taking application? Should it go to a CRM and pull back an account record? Should it compare this edition to a previous edition and make sure that our claims are lining up? It's these tools that allow the AI to do that, and it's a constantly expanding catalog of tools in the AmbitiousOS. The fifth primitive is routines. When should work happen without me asking for it? Routines are essentially the heartbeat of the system. And a system that only works when I remember to prompt it is still dependent on me starting the work. And that's useful, but it's not what we've talked about as always on. Scheduled jobs and automations actually run this stuff in the background because now the AmbitiousOS can ingest a new edition automatically. It can prepare the next edition automatically. It can update and refresh the underlying knowledge graph in memory. That is a hugely important one for a routine because every single night, the AmbitiousOS goes through something akin to a dream cycle where it actually gardens the underlying knowledge graph, which is a huge amount of work and maintenance that has to be done every single night. In software, we call these things cron jobs. The word cron derives from chronos, meaning time-based job. The system does not need to wait for me to constantly update it. It can routinely do that itself. And this is one of the most important in primitives because as I've been talking about, a lot of what we have to do every day is just to maintain the system that's helping us do it, keeping track of what's changed and revisiting old assumptions and connecting the new things to the old things. The routines can allow us to do that in an automated fashion, or as what I've described as always on. Now, the sixth, this one I love, is portability. And the current best way to think about portability is a technical term called a model context protocol. You've heard it abbreviated as MCP. But what that really is in plain English is the ability for you to travel with the brain. Now, early versions of the AmbitiousOS were only accessible in this user experience. But today's version of AmbitiousOS is accessible in multiple places, including inside of ChatGPT. Let me make sure that you all can see that. Including inside of ChatGPT, as well as other places that you might want to access this brain, including Claude Code and Codex. And now via MCP, the AmbitiousOS can essentially travel to other AI environments with you, which I think is a really important feature because it allows you to use the AI where the work is happening. If I'm drafting an email, I don't want to leave that workflow to go to the AmbitiousOS to help me do some drafting and then copy it back. I might want to access the AmbitiousOS directly there where I'm doing the work. And in other AI harnesses, you could start marrying our brain with your Gmail, your calendar, your productivity tools like Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. You can essentially put the AI where the work is happening and start to use it in a headless kind of way, which is a term that's been increasingly used to talk about this capability. And the portability features allow that to happen. And finally, the seventh primitive is the build loop. How does the system improve itself? Now, today, Claude Code and Codex drive the build loop, and this is the newest and most exciting part of AmbitiousOS, because now I can use Codex to build the next version of the AmbitiousOS by just writing the next edition of Reading Ambitiously. Go with me for a second on that. The first version of AI coding was to ask the AI to help you write code. The next version, the one we're in right now, was to actually give the AI the ability to live in your code repo and have all the access to the things it needs to flourish at generating code. But this new version allows me to actually feed all the context directly to the code writing agents directly from the AmbitiousOS. Thus, when I hit publish on tomorrow's edition or today's edition of Reading Ambitiously, Codex can automatically pick that up, derive out product requirements and feature sets, and add them to the roadmap for AmbitiousOS and start to build those things. Think about that. The system I'm building becomes a part of the environment used to build the system. And this is what is sometimes referred to as having a recursive nature. This is actually what 𝗦𝗂𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗀𝘀 just went back to Anthropic to work on, because his goal is to figure out how to have AI researchers create AI that can do AI research, because they'll just get a whole lot better at it than the humans. And that will allow us to continue up on the exponential progress that we're experiencing. I know this is mind-boggling and singularity-like in nature, but I think we're only touching the tip of the iceberg of the systems that can actually improve themselves with their own context. So if I zoom way, way out, I don't want to lose the plot here. I think that these lessons can be applied into a framework for how to build a system like this. Because first, number one, the AI needs the context, and very quickly it needs to know how the context relates to itself. Second, it needs memory so that it can explain how that context has evolved over time. It needs skills so that it knows how to do tasks and jobs. It needs tools so that they can actually operationalize taking actions on those jobs. It needs routines so that it can do them automatically in an always-on fashion. It needs to be portable and available where you're actually doing the work. And it needs to ultimately use itself to get better. I think these, as of June 12th, are the best description I can come up with of the emergent AI native architecture. Make sure that the AmbitiousOS captures that claim. We'll see how it pans out. Because the more I build in this direction, the more I believe that this is where knowledge work is going. Not because everyone's going to build a newsletter operating system, but because everyone is going to have some version of this. And AI changes what's possible, but only if it has access to the right context at the right time in the right place with the right tools. And we ultimately shape those tools, and thereafter the tools start to shape us. And I'm feeling it only 4.5 months into building this. I hope you stay ambitious, my friends. It's my pleasure to be with you every single week. And if you're really ambitious and you've read or listened this far, you will take today's post, you will ingest it into your favorite AI model, and you will say, let's build this together. And we'll see you again next week for another edition of Reading Ambitiously. Bye-bye.